be here with you today, and I'd like to thank Amy for her introduction. I think of all the colleagues I know, Amy is absolutely one of the top ones for whom I have just complete respect and awe for her ability and commitment to children and the early childhood profession. So it was a great surprise and joy to find out she was going to be introducing this session. We're going to talk about resilience today, the art, science, and imperative of rebounding from adversity. And I say imperative because we have to go forward, but we need to recognize that we've all been through something in the past 14 or 15 months that's been pretty incredible in a lot of ways, and not all of them good. And so how do we pick ourselves up and keep going forward in a positive way? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a little bit about me. I have deep North Carolina roots. For those of you who are in North Carolina, I grew up in Charlotte. I got my undergraduate degree from Wake Forest University, and my first professional job was as a learning disabilities teacher in the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Public Schools. So even though I'm not physically in North Carolina, I sort of feel like I'm in North Carolina, at least virtually. And so it's really a double pleasure to be with you guys today. I'm a licensed school psychologist and child psychologist. I worked 30 years in pediatric healthcare. So I really look at child development both from an educational as well as a health and developmental perspective. So I want you to just take a quick second to think about how you're feeling today and how have you felt in the last week, or how about in the last month, because it's important for us to keep a pulse on where our emotions and feelings are at any given time, because whatever we're feeling and thinking is what we bring to any interaction that we have with another person. We can't just leave all that behind. And so it's important to stay in touch with our own feelings and emotions. You know, some of you may be kind of in in a phase of still feeling some sadness, anxiety, fear, some moments, some days a little hopeless, and all of that can be exhausting, right? I know certainly I've had phases where these have been the predominant emotions for me. On the other hand, some days, and some of you may be feeling a little more hopeful, maybe cautious, but more optimistic and glad. I think there's some reasons why we could start feeling some of those things, but everybody processes these events in different ways. So just take a couple of seconds to check in, take a pulse on where you are, and it might be a real mix of these things. Why do we need to even focus on this? Well, if we have persistent feelings that we're not dealing with, especially negative or difficult emotions, those can stick with us and really emerge in unpredictable ways. We know that they can certainly affect our mental and our physical health, but they also will affect how we interact with others. And because most of us in early childhood are in a caregiving professional role, however we're feeling, we're going to bring to our interactions with children and families and even our colleagues. And so we need to have a good understanding of where we are. Sometimes sharing some of our feelings can lighten the burden. If we can put a name on it, often we can more easily deal with it. It's like naming it almost draws a boundary around it that suddenly makes it more manageable. And let's not forget, we are always modeling for young children how you do this, how you identify, recognize, label, and manage your emotions. We are role models for them, whether we want to be or not. And I just think it's so important to remember that a teacher affects eternity. He or she can never tell where his or her influence stops. So the nature of your interactions with children, families, and colleagues is perhaps the most important element of your work. So think about that. Your interactions are probably the most important element of your work. So in light of that, here's what we're going to quickly cover today. I'll talk just a little bit about the science of resilience, because there's a lot of it, some strategies and priorities to achieve what I think really is the imperative of resilience. We've got to find our resilience to really move through what's happened to us in the past year with the pandemic and the other things that have happened in our society. in order to kind of come out on the other side. And then I'll close with what I like to think of as the art of resilience. If you have comments or questions, please put those in the chat, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes at the end where we can get to some of the things that you're asking and saying. So I probably don't need to read through this whole list of all the stresses on families that happened as a result of the pandemic. And many of these families, as you know, already had a lot of stresses. So this was new stresses on top of existing stresses. But, you know, there were certainly the financial implications for many people of the pandemic, the loss of access to supportive educational and health services. Food insecurity just went through the roof for so many millions of people in the nation. Reduced access to supportive social networks, whether that was professional colleagues or family or friends, when everybody was isolating at home, those social networks really diminished, and that was extremely stressful for so many people. Certainly health challenges related to COVID-19 and that confinement to home. I think another huge stress has been really not knowing exactly how COVID-19 is going to end. I think we have a little bit more of an idea now, but if you think about where we were last June, July, even last October, we really didn't know what was going to happen with the vaccine, when and if it would be available, how widely it would be available, and those kinds of things. And so, you know, having that ongoing uncertainty is one of the most anxiety provoking circumstances for a lot of people. And then, as if that weren't enough, there was all this renewed intense focus on racism and social justice, and then the political environment. All of this was just a lot of factors all at once, creating tremendous stress. You know, we had horrific stories and videos of these policing things with fatal outcomes, and those are burdens that are very difficult for adults to process. I mean, for myself, I cannot ever unsee that video of George Floyd. I mean, like, once you see any of that, I think it's just indelibly imprinted in our brains. You can't unsee it. And so that is an ongoing trauma that we have to keep processing. And there's still stories in the news about that and other similar events. And so, you know, this is trauma and emotional burden coming at us all the time, as well as these other things that I've listed here. And again, with all of these things, there's just no clear sense exactly of how and when things are going to definitely get better. There's just still so much uncertainty about these things. And I feel my shoulders starting to go up as I even talk about it. I mean, these things are really stressful for everyone. When you think about what's happened, what have early childhood professionals experienced in the last year? I mean, a lot of the same things that we talked about for families, because you have families too. So all of those things affected you. But then in addition, your job put you in a situation of new stress, because suddenly you were having to learn all kinds of new technology potentially. You were facing potentially overwhelming needs of the families that you were serving. You know, many of us, or most of us, or all of us, went into early childhood partly because we love hanging out with young children. And that's a huge plus in our profession. And all of a sudden we lost the physical contact with them. I mean, that's a loss. And you know, at some level, we're probably going to grieve about that in some way. And then, of course, programs have faced these really difficult decisions on whether, when, and how to bring children back to centers. And then, as I said, these other stresses in society you also were experiencing. If you have already opened up, and I'd love to hear from some of you in chat, have you opened up already? And if so, are your classrooms different from what they were before? You know, I know there are many preschool and childcare situations where parents are not allowed now to bring their children into the classroom. My daughter has an 18-month-old and a 4-year-old. and they're not able to bring the children into the classroom. A teacher meets them outside the building and they have the handoff there. So that's different. These things aren't all necessarily bad. They're just changes. And with change, there can be more anxiety. Adults in the programs may be wearing masks still, which can impede the child's reading of the adult's emotions. There may be social distancing requirements. Again, I'd be interested to hear in your program if you're trying to get kids to social distance from one another, or teachers to social distance from each other, or the kids, are rooms having to be rearranged, or certain materials being taken out. And the upshot of all of this is you have to learn new behaviors, right? Some schools may have given up on shared toys. Now everybody's got individual bags or bins of stuff. And I really feel for early childhood providers, because sometimes I have this vision that you must feel like the germ police, like, are you constantly watching the kids to see if they're, make sure they're washing their hands, or are they bunching up and getting too close? And that's got to be a real stress on you to feel so responsible for that, taking care health-wise of the children and of yourself and of your colleagues. But at the same time, you're just trying to get through your day, and you want the kids to have a good quality experience when they're there. School schedules have been helter-skelter, with some having a partial schedule, or they're in school and then they're back out of school and childcare. And so again, all of this can trickle down to a lot of stress on teachers and staff. I think there's some good news. I know there's some good news in the early childhood field that's a direct result, actually, of the pandemic. I believe that some early childhood professionals and programs actually may have established better connections with families because of technology, and because when the pandemic shut everything down, they suddenly had to become so intentional about trying to reach every single child and family. And that may have actually fostered some stronger connections with families. I don't know, you guys tell me, but I think that I have heard that happened in some situations. I certainly think there's far greater public understanding today than a year or 2 years ago of your value and importance to society. And we're all aware that there's been massively increased advocacy by early childhood organizations to really take advantage of the crisis to showcase and emphasize how early childhood systems are so essential to the US economy and workforce, not to mention to the optimal development of the next generation. So let's think for a minute how COVID-19 and these other things could really affect children's experiences and behavior. Because again, as I said, with any interaction, each individual in that interaction is bringing their emotional state and their recent experiences to that interaction, and is going to have an impact whether you see it directly or you don't. So we all know that children take their cues from the adults around them. So if adults are stressed, children have unbelievable radar, and they pick up on that. Children also are seeing and hearing these scary images and sounds and words from the media. They're hearing it from their family. They may not get the full picture at all. They may be just hearing little snippets because their family is trying to prevent them from seeing and hearing these things. But they pick up on it, but they don't fully understand it, and they don't necessarily know how to process it. And so that means stress and fears for young children. They're out of their familiar routines. They lost physical contact with extended family and friends. My granddaughter last July, she had just turned 4. She'd been out of her childcare since March. And she actually said one day to her mother, this just broke my heart. She said to her mom one day in July, "I feel like I'm forgetting what my friends' faces looked like." I mean, what an expression of what she was sensing as a deep loss, that she couldn't even remember for sure what her friends' faces looked like. So they felt that loss in this, to a great extent in the same way that adults did. Of course, we're all aware there are reports of increased domestic violence and child abuse during confinement. And I think very sadly and tragically, as children are coming back into programs, we will start to see more evidence of that in some circumstances. I hope I'm wrong, but that's, you know, all indications are we're probably going to see that. And then those classrooms, when they return, can look very different. And that doesn't mean they're bad or worse, but it's just a change for children at a time when they've already had so much change and upheaval. And so that can make it harder for children to kind of find their footing as they start to come back into programs or even come into programs for the first time. So with all of that, you know, as background context, you know, we've really got to muster our deep inner resilience, don't we? So I wanted to start with a little definition of what resilience is. It's the human ability to adapt in the face of tragedy, trauma, adversity, or hardship, and ongoing significant life stressors. And this definition was from 2005 with the American Psychological Association. So actually, resilience has been pretty heavily studied by psychology researchers, and we know a lot about the science of resilience in adults. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is that resilience skills are on a continuum. It's not like certain people have all the resilience and other people have none of the resilience. Resilience potential is within all of us, and it can be developed and learned. So if you're not feeling terribly resilient this week or this month or this year, it doesn't mean you have to stay stuck with where you are. Resilience is also very, very common. Most people have some resilience. Again, they may not realize it every moment in time that they do, and they may not show it effectively all the time, but most of us have resilience inside us, and we can pull that out. It's important to understand resilience can be present in one aspect of our life and maybe not another. So for example, you know, you may be a person who keeps it all together and you're the model citizen at work and you're the one bolstering everybody else's spirits and putting a smile on your face, and then you go home and you just collapse into a black mood, or you snap at your partner because you mustered all of your energy to be resilient in one setting at work, and at some point you have to let it go and let someone else pick you up. Or maybe it's the opposite. You're super resilient at home with your family, but then when you get to work with your colleagues, somehow you forget how to be resilient in that environment. You might be resilient one year, and then another year, somehow you're not finding your resilience skills. So it's one of those inconsistent things in human behavior. But again, it can be developed and learned. It's a personal process for all of us. But science has also really identified key characteristics of resilient people. So I'm not going to read the whole list to you, but if you look at the list and think a little bit about it, and I'd like you to take a couple of seconds to think about which of these characteristics you think you have that you could muster to help you be more resilient, or that you think has been particularly helpful as you've moved through this very difficult time. And again, if you feel like sharing through the chat, we will come back to that toward the end of the presentation. I'd love to hear from you. But you can see there are a whole range of characteristics that help people be more resilient. And you don't have to have all of them. You may only need a couple of them. So, you know, what are the ones that you seem to have a natural affinity for, and how can you build that? So you're reflecting now on that. So keep going on that. And then, you know, I absolutely love trees. I just love being among trees and looking at all different kinds of trees. So last summer, I actually read a book about the biology of trees, and I was actually stunned to learn that in a forest, trees have all kinds of chemical ways of checking on each other and determining which trees are really strong and especially which trees are struggling. And they actually will send resources to trees that are suffering to try and help them get strong again. And if you think about the power of that tree community, human communities are exactly the same way. So, you know, when one person is down, others of us can lift them up. And so, you know, don't ever forget that you are part of a community, and that mutual help and support is what we all need. And just like the trees, when people come together, to help and bolster one another, really the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. And you may never know how and when you help someone, but just know that you are. So how do we build resilience in young children? Well, again, research and child development has a lot to tell us about this, and nearly all of this is stuff that you probably already know. So a lot of what we already know has absolute applications starting today or last week or last month, and certainly in the months ahead. So we do know that exposure to trauma, family instability, or compromised parenting do increase risk for later problems, right? I mean, that's not new information for any of you. What's really important to emphasize is that research shows that early intervention reduces the impact of adverse child events on young children. There was a study that came out about the Ready Head Start curriculum, and they actually followed kids from preschool into high school to see what the impact was of those children's history of adverse childhood experiences, and also what was the impact of the children who received the Ready intervention compared to the children who didn't. And they found that the children who had ACEs but also received that Ready intervention, which focused a lot on mental health strategies, had far better outcomes and attachment and security in high school. So it was a very long-term robust effect. So that's really encouraging. Again, as I said at the beginning, you are going to have an impact as an early childhood educator on the young children and families. And you may never know directly how you did that, but all indications are you are having an impact. So let's make it the best positive impact we possibly can. So as a result of all this, trauma-informed care is widely used and really becoming a standard of care. And I think, you know, in today's times, pretty much all of us have been traumatized by the pandemic and everything around it that's happened. And events don't have to meet the criteria, official criteria for trauma to have a negative impact on a child. Some children are going to have really significant reactions to something that may, in our minds, seem pretty minor, but in their mind is big. And there are lots of individual differences. But I think given what everyone has been through in the last 14 or 15 months, it's probably prudent to put on that trauma-informed lens and prepare for all children to have potentially some struggles, recognizing many of them and most of them ultimately will be just fine because kids are resilient. So what are some strategies for cultivating resilience in young children? Well, first and foremost, your individual relationships and conversations with each child are so important. Having those predictable routines, open-ended play that can foster their self-awareness and positive identity. And you see the other things on here. And again, these are all things that we know and do every day, but they're more important now than ever. Teaching emotions, recognizing emotions in yourself and in others, and teaching children how to label and process and channel those emotions. Directly promoting resilience through interactive read-alouds or activities, modeling grit and a growth mindset, and then teaching and modeling pro-social skills and social problem-solving skills. All of these things are important for cultivating resilience. Don't hesitate to do some assessments if you feel that you really need to get more information on each child's emotional and mental health status. Things like the Devereaux tools, the DECA and the E-DECA are really proven effective tools to get a baseline and help you figure out where you need to deploy resources for each child or maybe for your whole program. And, you know, parents of young children have certainly had a very, very rough year. And so providing resources for them, like promoting resilience for now and forever, or even building your bounce, these are great, again, proven effective resources. If you are a program leader, now more than ever, your actions really signal your priorities, and you want to make sure that your actions are aligned with the priorities that you're trying to communicate. And you really need to show that you care about every employee and that you're more trustworthy than ever. Engage all of your leaders, both your formal and your informal leaders in your program. You know, there's a lot of money coming into early childhood, so by all means seek and offer extra resources because people need it and it will pay off down the road. Create a trauma-informed workplace and certainly try to build in some downtime and fun. And I'll wrap up with this, what I frame as the art of resilience, which again, this is my definition, so this is nothing official, but to me, the art of resilience is how we bring our creativity, our storytelling, and our own humanity to the process. And I had the tremendous opportunity a couple of months ago. I was just watching TV, and I saw an interview with Ken Burns, the documentary film producer, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is a renowned historian and author of biographies of famous people. And the interviewer asked both of them, you know, what can we learn from history? What can we learn from the past that will help us now get through what we're experiencing with this pandemic and all the social unrest and all of that? And you know, what are our signposts? And it was so fascinating to watch these two brilliant historians who work in very different ways, but what they both said was it's the stories that were left behind from previous difficult, tragic, traumatic events in our history, say the Civil War, World War II, Vietnam, the pandemic, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And they said it's the individual stories that people left behind, whether it was letters written home by soldiers on the battlefront to loved ones that they thought they might never see again. You know, what did they show us about their bravery, their courage, their heart? What photos were left behind? How did they interpret what was happening to them in the moment? What stories did they leave behind? And they said, you know, it's going to be the same thing with the strife of today. It's what individual stories will be told to ourselves and to our loved ones that will be the signposts for future generations of how we were resilient and got through this. So I would ask each of you to think, what will your story be? Here's a couple of quick references for you, more on resilience if you're interested in that. And I would like to thank all of you for being here today. Here's